friend? My name is Misha, and I really want to tell you about Electroball, an urban adventure set in the city of electric intrigue. We fight robots, channel magic, and make powerful allies, all to solve a mystery that can mean the fate of the entire city. Episodes are under 90 minutes long and published weekly, so come join us for Electroball over at Dice Carnival. Available wherever you listen to podcasts. Alright, I'll let you get back to your show.
Welcome back to Beholder to No One, a D&D podcast. Today, Greg and I are here with Mike from the Tales of Asperran.
Tales of Asperran. It's a hard A.
Okay, that's good because I don't really have a headache currently, so I think we're good here.
Tales of Asperran. Now, this is an actual play 5th edition game.
Yep, 5th edition.
And we're
loosely,
yeah. And we're here to talk about world building specifically, but we wanted to focus on if there's a difference between world building in an actual play game versus a normal just in-person game. And I think a first good question that Greg had was, what is the difference between actual play and just a normal TTRPG game?
So actual play, at least in my experience from our show and a lot of other shows that I have listened to and kind of follow. So a regular game, you're at home with your friends, you're sitting down, just playing whatever game you're playing. That could be like Monster of the Week, D&D, Pathfinder, whatever floats your boat. But you know, you're at home, you're playing or online, and you're playing a game with your friends. You could take a break that lasts 15 minutes. Your party could argue in circles for 25 minutes.
God, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's part kind of like a part of the experience, but the difference there is that nobody's listening. So those cyclical arguments can be kind of funny and great for you with your friends, but when you're recording an actual play, I'd say the experience, at least as a player and a DM, is almost the same. The difference is everyone is a little conscious that, you know, you have someone listening. And for us, what we do is we record our sessions, and then while I'm doing the editing, I will write narrations, I will add ambient sounds and music, and things like that. Just make a home game, which is basically what you're listening to, just edited down. Make it feel more immersive, make it feel like you're listening to more of an audio drama that has dice rolls and, like, you know, side conversations to kind of like lay everything out.
Yeah, and I was reading online that somebody wrote that actual play technically isn't actual play because it's an edited version that is more performance-based sometimes in the situations of like Critical Role and the Adventure Zone and stuff like that. But it's still playing. You just have to be a little bit more conscientious of entertainment value.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Like I said, there are bits where, like, sometimes, I mean, again, in a home game, you know, your party and you're with your friends. You all know each other. Someone may make kind of a joke that is a little insensitive or, you know, just a little raunchy or something. But when we're playing, sometimes those jokes will still come out while we're playing. And I either say, hey, just heads up, I'm going to cut that out, or I'll like roll something in back and be like, that's not a kind of tone we want to set for our show. Can you say something else? Which is fine. Everyone is kind of okay with it, but that's another difference in the setup we have.
Gonna have to keep the inside thoughts inside.
Now, I mean, some of our best moments are still ad-libbed out, but we have the beauty of editing to kind of
amplify those best moments.
Yeah, amplify them. That's a good word. I don't want to say trim because that's not really the goal of it.
And that's true, like in any game, because Greg and I, we've played in at table games for a couple of years now together, and with my husband and his wife and their roommates, and we go off on tangents all the time, whether it's about the game where we're just paralyzed with what decision to make, or whether it's on tangents about, oh my god, did you see this thing I saw on Facebook? And those types of things take away from the game. But when it's in person, it's like, oh, whatever, we're just shooting the shit, we don't really care. But when it's recorded, you have to care a little bit more and be a little bit more conscious of those decisions and those conversations.
One thing that I can say, you just kind of got me in this train of thought, is that I really appreciate about doing stuff for a podcast is that because everyone is conscious of the fact that we're recording, the amount of like, oh, this thing I saw on Facebook, or oh, have you started watching this show yet? It doesn't happen. So like the entire experience of playing the game is just almost 100% us playing the game, and that's it. There's no distractions. Everyone is like pulled in and immersed. It's like a very different experience from the home games that I've played.
I don't understand, and I love it, and I want that.
Yeah, it's great. Again, that might just be because my cast is very attention focused to that, but like the only time we have deviance is like in the very beginning of the recording before I start kind of introducing them to the game. Or my favorite thing to do to my players is, and you might really enjoy this, sometimes when I want to end an episode, I will kind of not necessarily lead the narrative, but like, how when you're playing a D&D game, you'll give the narration for the big monster that just arrived, and then you'll start initiative. For us, that usually is at the end of a recording, and then I'll just mute the microphone and listen to them lose their minds, and then that devolves into like comfortable chatter and deviation, and then I use those bits for our bloopers and stuff at the end of the episode.
Nice.
Yeah.
So that's a good distinction between actual play and at the table. And I guess that transitions into how long have you been creating worlds for games specifically, not necessarily actual play, but just games in general?
Oof. So you may get a little bit of a story here. So when I hit the end of my like high school career, I didn't really know what I was going to do. And I knew I liked video games, so someone had suggested to me that, oh, go do this thing associated to video games. So I went to college for that. And then I kind of, after going to school, I animate, I do art. And after going to school for that, I kind of learned that for me, what has always sucked me into the world building is storytelling. And I have been apparently doing that for as long as I can remember. I just didn't realize in like the terms of how I play with my toys, how I engaged with the video games that I happen to have and be playing. I was always building these little places. I didn't have a word for it. But for as long as I can remember, I have been doing that. Now, if talk about like formal world building for like a game setting, I started building Asperran, I'd say 6 years ago, 7 if you want to lay down like the idea of it and like things that I thought would be cool. But the cool thing about Asperran is that the setting has existed since the beginning. All my home games have been run in this setting, and every time I run a campaign, I kind of build onto it based on what happens. Like if the player contributes something new that I didn't have, that's now a part of the world, and then the next campaign can interact with that if they'd like. But I've been working on this particular world for about 6 or 7 years.
Damn.
Ish.
That's super cool. And it's like it's not only like you working on it. You said that like if a player mentions something that you wanted in the world or that you thought is a good idea, you just add it into it.
Oh yeah, one thing that again I do this. I've always done this as a world building thing, and it has worked very, very well for an actual play setting. Is that I have the big dots on the map, the important stuff, like this city, this giant forest region, and then I don't really fill them in too much. I have like a couple sentences or two about like what this place is, but I leave it very open. So every time new players come and engage with the world, and they're like, I want my background to be, I want to be chased by a cult. Okay, what do we want? Then we talk about the cult. We build the cult together, and then I just inject it into the world, into one of those blank spaces that I have intentionally left there, so that like the world building isn't always me. Because I kind of, as a DM, I kind of really don't like that. I love it to be a kind of a collaborative experience.
Very nice.
So my players tend to bleed into Asperran a lot.
That's actually, it's really interesting because like the first time I've created my own world was recently. It was within the last year. And this was a whole world completely from scratch. And I just like did a random map generator. And then I looked at each of the places and I was like, okay, how are they going to be very overall? Like what little information, for example, if you're thinking of somebody from the United States, what kind of information would they know about China without a formal education on it? Or about Australia? Like just those little things. And I plotted that aspect of it out. And then I hyper-focused on one or two areas. When I got to the area that they're in now, I plotted it out a little bit more, but only in the sense of I knew that I wanted it to be a crime city, and I knew that I wanted each section to be owned by a particular family who is a crime lord of sorts. So I planned out what their crime focuses were and who the head honchos were, but not much beyond that. And then when the party actually got there, I let them interject what they wanted to focus on and what families they wanted to participate with based off the little information they did have before I expounded upon that further.
I have something to add that might be pretty interesting. So one thing that I will admit I have not. This is not an idea I've come up with. I actually found it when I was listening to a show called Campaign Skyjacks, and they encountered a boss level enemy. They knew its pirate ship existed. And the DM said, there are tons of terrible rumors about this pirate ship. Now, if it were like a home game, the DM would just kind of, let them do rolls and spill that information like an exposition dump. Mm-hmm. But the DM did something that really changed my viewpoint on how to world build. He looked at each player and he goes, okay, let's have some fun. Let's talk about some of the rumors we've heard about this ship. And every person came up with a kind of terrifying rumor about the ship. And the DM goes, thanks. You as players all know for a fact that those are all 100% true.
That's awesome.
And it was so cool. And he let them build their own boss. And he let them build the structure for their boss encounter. And all they were doing was just riffing off of rumors. And that kind of engagement from your players into your world was just unreal. I had never heard of anybody doing that before. So I was immediately doing it. In our most recent episode we just popped out, I had made up a restaurant that was a front for criminals. And I didn't have a reason why whatever they did was illegal. But one of our players joked that, it's a sushi place. Who would make sushi illegal? And I was like, wait, hold on. There's something here. Let's figure out why they made the sushi that they sell here illegal.
Nice.
And then it just spiraled into this fun, technically, I guess you could call it a tangent from a gaming perspective, but it was just so different than anything I've ever played with.
That's super awesome. I've never actually sat down and created a whole world myself. Most of the games that I've DM'd or been a part of have all been book, just pre-made campaigns. But one of my favorite things in D&D is the collaborative effort of the DM and the players to make a cohesive story. That's what I strive for when DMing my game, either by implementing or just taking backgrounds of characters and implementing them into the story, or taking notes on stuff that people have said throughout the campaign of what their hometowns like and stuff like that, and then just kind of injecting that into the campaign.
Yep.
Yeah, that kind of thing I love it so much, because realistically, as a world builder, you can make this amazing and cool place. When anyone interacts with it, there's a very high chance they're gonna come up with an idea that you would have never thought of, or never even occurred to you.
We were all pretty high level, I think. Well, not high, but 10, 11-ish. And we were in a city and we had all this money. And the DM's like, well, what do you want to do with it? And each of us decided to put it into the city to help expand the city more and to improve it. Because we're have thousands and thousands of gold. We might as well use it for the betterment of the city that we are protecting. So my character made an orphanage, one character made a bank. So we all used it to make it better like the 6+
That
months
is
that we were
so
playing.
cool. I don't think I've ever encountered that in any game I've ever been in. Like that kind of like philanthropy from the players, because usually they either want to sit on their gold forever, like yeah.
To be fair, we had a lot of gold and a lot of magic items already, so we didn't need anything else for magic items. We were kind of a little bit overpowered, but we had a lot of gold.
Yeah, at one point my players had won a. Actually, this is funny because this is how there's a shopkeep that they encounter with. The reason the shopkeep exists is because they had gone through this competition in the world where like adventurers kind of climb into a maze beneath the city to compete for a prize that this guild has placed somewhere within. And my players not only stole the treasure from the person winning, they managed to slip out of the maze in a way that nobody noticed, so no one knows where the gold went. And they walked away with like 20,000 gold. And like they immediately, every single one of them all wanted to buy weapons and things like that. Man, I really wish I've had players that thought of that. That is so cool.
I personally, like, to be fair, I personally love city building games, and Greg can attest to this. I constantly want to add it to every game ever.
That's so cool.
Or I just want to play a game where you are a commoner and you are building up a city from scratch with nothing. I think that's just a super interesting way to play, and it's a much more heavy role play aspect versus a normal adventure. But that's my favorite thing, honestly, is just building the story versus the adventure. I love adventuring too, but I think it's because I don't get to play it very often because they don't really exist. The focus is always on the adventure, which is fine.
Yeah, I would love a campaign that just sits in a city and never really leaves. That would be very cool.
Well, if you DM one, let me know, please.
Yeah, let her know. She'll be more than happy.
I already have a city for it. I built out a whole. This is another thing that I've learned a harsh lesson for when it comes to podcast running stuff for a podcast is that don't spend a ton of time building out the details of a place because so your players could leave on a whim, and then because it's a podcast, they may never come back, and you probably wouldn't revisit it because you might just tread on old ground, which might be boring for the listeners. So like I built out this giant mega city that has like 10 districts and like a dock that's built literally beneath the city. And like I planned out all the factions and guilds and schools, and my players probably spent 2 sessions there. And then we're like, all right, we're leaving.
I had that happen in a real life game and I was so mad.
Yeah.
See, again, that's why you implement the Pac-Man rule and you just say, oh, you're going out that way. Congratulations, you're back on the other side of the city.
To be fair, when they went to, so when they were in the original city that I actually spent a little bit of time on, like I planned approximately like 4 characters that I was super excited for them to meet. And there was more characters that I should have had, but I was kind of in a funk. But they left after like an hour in the city. And they're like, where's the next adventure? Oh, there's a boat. So when they got to the Batia, which is where they're at now, I literally told them, like, this was not a recording game, but I'm like, I want you guys to stay here for a little bit. I worked really hard on this area. Can we please, like, just chill here? You don't have to travel. I swear.
There's adventure, I promise.
But they were cool with it. They're like, yeah, sure, that's fine. And we skipped ahead 4 months in game because I wanted them to be a higher level. So I was like, you're magically level 11. Tell me what you're doing for the next 4 months, and we'll figure that out next week.
Cool.
Jeez.
That's actually, you just brought up a very good point. That's something that hasn't, at least in terms of our actual play, I haven't encountered yet, is downtime. I guess maybe it's just because of like the pace of the show, but they're constantly doing stuff. There hasn't been really any downtime at all.
I think downtime is important, but I think it's kind of like the way Adventure Zone does it. They do one every couple of episodes, like after each mini arc, so to speak. They have like an episode of downtime.
It's like the lunar interlude.
Yeah, exactly.
Or whatever they call them.
Yeah, the lunar interludes and the fantasy Costco, which is like my favorite thing.
Those are, I think, important because then it explains what's happening. Because some adventures, yes, it makes complete sense that it's just constant go, 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 go. but there are things that need to happen, like you're restocking your potions, you are upgrading your equipment, you are fixing issues that happen. You just want to have a damn drink at a bar without being attacked by somebody. Like, I think it's kind of hit or miss. Those might be their least listened to episodes. I don't know. Some people might just want the adventure.
Yeah,
But
maybe.
I think downtime personally is fun, but I'm also that person that wants to create an entire city. So
Every good podcast has at least one shopping episode.
Yeah.
shopping.
You got Gilmore, you got Garfield. Like
Yeah,
all
Garfield, the Deals
yeah.
Warlock.
I love Garfield. Garfield
As do I.
inspired one of our NPCs, which is I hate doing as a DM like plain shopping, just because like if the players are like, I want to go buy some rope, I don't want to spend the time role playing out that scenario, because odds are I just built that shopkeep 30 seconds after they asked. So it's not like super planned out and valuable. So might be good advice for anyone who wanting to do an actual play, but if you can find a way to make a shopkeep that your players can encounter frequently, it leaves like an anchor for the audience, and then they can look forward to the next shopping encounter that ever happens. Like our show there's someone named Bayette. They're our first kind of gender neutral, non-binary character, but they're the patron of necessity. And they have this shop that sits on the border of the Feywild and the real world. And if at any time anyone ever has like a great need for something, which in DM speak is, I can just drop the shop in wherever I think it might be interesting.
There you go.
Yeah, but what it ends up being is this kind of interdimensional shop that like changes and sculpts itself to the player's needs. Like in one of our more recent episodes, we had a thing where I thought it'd be interesting for the audience if it was very clear that the shop made sections without the owner knowing. So like they're walking through the shelves and the player looks over and sees this item that, or that the character looks over and sees this item that the player really wanted. The shop has like built a tiny expansion and slapped it on like an addition, and now that little piece is a role-playing encounter.
I love that.
But yeah, if you're doing an actual play, world build in a relatable shopkeep that shows up often, because the fans, the audience absolutely love it. They just like have something to sink into.
That's amazing. I actually, that was one of the things I was actually going to bring up with Nikki when we were planning on starting the actual play game, was that we need a shopkeep that's like a recurring character, because a lot of the big characters and a lot of the shows that are out, like Critical Role, so on and so forth, a lot of the ones that are the more beloved are the shopkeeps that they run into.
Mm-hmm.
Pumat Soul, Gilmore.
Yeah, Pumat Soul is amazing.
Oh, yeah,
I love Pumat.
Hi there. Yeah, I love Pumat. Yeah, that's another thing. It's like a very good anchor for the audience to like grasp into. That like cool, fun, relatable shopkeep who's a little mysterious. That's what I love about Garfield. Is he's so in a subtle way, he's very scary, but he's very friendly.
Nobody knows what he looks like.
What's funny is like if you listen to the Adventure Zone live shows, they just mention any NPC and the crowd's like,
oh that's true.
Yes. Like every single NPC period, there is a huge shout out, and I'm just like, Jeeps.
It happens so much that like, so I know in later episodes they're like, no, don't clap for that. Don't you clap for that.
You know what he did.
We just said a name.
That's all we've done. It's getting to our heads.
I have a topic I think might be interesting. It kind of leads into how I do some of my world building too. If you want to talk about
it.
Is I think the audience relates to the NPCs so strongly, because like the player characters, they're piloted by the cast. So like as a listener, you're constantly making that equation between the player and the character that they're running. But the NPCs are like a blank template because the DM plays all of them. So like there's no like cast connection to those characters aside from the relationships that they build. So I think your audiences really look at the side, like the NPCs, the side characters, the people who show up, and grab onto them because they're like the easiest characters for them to grab on and relate to. And that brings up another kind of really good point that I tried since we started an actual play. I've tried very hard to make sure we have as many representations of as many different people as possible, so that the audience has ample people to grab onto and relate to, and then they get to see that this world is just as diverse and fun and beautiful as ours is.
That's definitely important. It's hard when there's only like 4 people playing. You can't necessarily get that diversity specifically with the players. Like, you can have some diversity, but there's always going to be somebody left out unless you have dozens of players.
Yeah, absolutely.
So having NPCs like that is perfect. I actually, in my Monday game, that's one of the things I did. Was the family that they decided to go with was actually run by a man who was married to another man. And it was just normal. It's like, whatever. Yeah, this is my husband, and his husband likes flowers, and he's a gardener, and that's his thing. And it's just completely accepted and normal because that's how it should be. There was another one that's just a single older Hispanic woman. She refuses to marry. She doesn't have any interest, and the party doesn't know her very well, but has no interest in relationships whatsoever. So she's aromantic, asexual.
Well, I know it hasn't quite come out yet in our episodes I want to leave it as organic as possible for the audience, but one of our player characters is ace. We didn't find out for a while because, that topic, when you're ace, it doesn't really come up. Unless you're the type of person who tells everyone, which to each their own, that is absolutely fine. But it's made me very happy with our second show, because we kind of assembled I've made an effort to make sure we had like a diverse group of people who are all really entertaining and wonderful. And then we can do the same in the world. This is another kind of thing that I've had to change about my world building and like my encounter building. It was something the Adventure Zone did. And I didn't realize they were doing it until they put out their comic books, which is something that caught my attention. Was they never really, at least to my memory, they never really described the skin tone of anyone on their show, which I thought that was after the comic book came out. You realize that Angus is black, which that's absolutely amazing and wonderful. But I wouldn't, because I'm a white guy, I wouldn't have thought about that until the comic book came out. And there was a part of me that really loved that they didn't they left it open so that anyone listening can grab on and relate to their character. But then there's the other side of it where I kind of realized I need to be making the effort, because it kind of felt like a lazy way out. So my world building has changed a little bit in such a way that I constantly make the effort to write down very detailed descriptions of what people look like when it comes to eye color, skin tone, everything I can get, so that when I present it to the audience, it feels intentional and genuine.
Instead of oh, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want it to feel like an oh, by the way, which is it's a tricky line, to walk on, because, I mean, for our original show, we're majority white, and we don't want it to feel ever like a token kind of thing, which is I've made a very strong effort to make sure that doesn't happen. And this kind of brings me to one other thing that has changed. Anytime I introduce a character that I personally can't relate to, be it that person is disabled. Well, sorry, relate to is probably the wrong word, but
you don't have experience with.
Yeah. I'm as a straight white guy, there are a lot of people that I can't quite connect to on a really, really, really deep level, just because our experiences are different. But if I want to add in a character like our shopkeep who is gender neutral, non-binary, rather than just write this character based on how I viewed those people, viewed people of that, man, I'm trying to find the right words. I haven't really talked about this to any outward people, so I apologize if I'm stumbling a little.
You're good.
Reach out to people who are experiencing it themselves.
Yes, thank you for helping me find the words there. But rather than just write the character, because if you just write the character, you fall on the risk of injecting your own biases and tropes that you didn't even know were tropes.
Very true.
So rather than write it, I wrote down a concept, and then I just reached out to people who, for Bayette, our shopkeep, I reached out to someone who was non-binary, they, them, and I asked, hey, is this character okay? Is there anything about it that you would see as, problematic, that would paint, who you are in a bad way? And they gave me advice, and I changed things on the character, which some people think that that's a bad thing, but I think that it's like, at least for us, it's been very nice, because then I can step into this with confidence and knowing that, our portrayals, like the world that we're making, is very intentional and very diverse.
Yeah.
And we're not like stepping on anyone.
Right, you're not tiptoeing around eggshells trying to not insult anybody or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. So like there's no worry about it being insulting, because our humor, again, this is another thing for a podcast, the humor, some shows punch down, which that's a term I took from the Macro Brothers Adventure Zone. They do Mabim Bam, but in the beginning of their show, they said they had humor that did something called punching down, which is making jokes at the expense of people who are less fortunate than you are. Like they might have had a disabled joke early in the show, which they later identified as bad, but we make sure that all of our humor is punching up. So like, they're making fun of people who are in power. They're making fun of things like that, as opposed to making fun of people, at the expense of who they are.
Yeah, that's fair. And I know right now, on Twitter specifically, there's a huge issue going on about ableism.
Mm-hmm.
And
I've
somebody,
seen a lot about that.
the Mustangs Art on Twitter, they created a wheelchair.
I know. Yep, I know of her.
For D&D, and honestly, I looked at it and it looks so cool. And I've played a character in a wheelchair before, and it wasn't for D&D, but we built it specifically for my character, and I love it because it adds so much more to the world that can help you be inclusive. And people who are disabled are playing D&D. They need to have the ability, and they deserve to have the ability to play who they are and who they want to be, whether it's able-bodied or not. And if they want a wheelchair, if your character needs a wheelchair, then have it. If you need prosthetic limbs, then have it. Like, those things are important. And some people are throwing a fit
Oh my God.
about it. Like, they're so like, oh, that doesn't belong in my magical world where I fight dragons. I'm like, you're fighting dragons. There can be a magic wheelchair. Come on.
Yeah, really. Come on
Yeah,
now.
and that's the thing. Like, I've encountered this on more than one occasion where people look at tabletop games. Now, if you're running your home game with your friends, your opinions are your own, and if you're having an enjoyable experience, not at the expense of anyone else, in the privacy of your home, that's all for you. But when you step in kind of the public-facing actual play realm, like a lot of people find that when they look onto a podcast, like an actual play in the world building, they look for the same exact things that they would expect from a home game, which there are. I mean, the tabletop community, especially D&D, is a majority of white men who are, they have their opinions, but they look for that in their games. So you get kind of a virulent reaction from that toxic crowd of people when you kind of build these inclusive games. And they kind of look for it as like an escapism from their real world. So if people have especially toxic or violent opinions about other people, when they play D&D, they don't want to experience that, because to them, that's the thing they're escaping. So that's why you get such a virulent, like really disgusting reaction from someone who goes out of their way to make this amazing, combat wheelchair for disabled players to use in their games.
Right.
And that's a world building effort I have kind of personally made sure that I try to do, is that when we build our world, build our game, I'm not there yet, and I don't think I'll ever be at this point, but I always want to make Asperran feel like an escape for people who are outside of the normal bubble of D&D players, like people who are, straight, white, and totally fine. So I want to help make Asperran and as a world building thing, a mantra, like an escape for people who have disabilities and look at D&D and see themselves not represented at all.
That's what I want when we play our game, is even if it's not 100% perfect, I do want to have that inclusion, and I want to show different sides of everything.
Mm-hmm.
I know for my character specifically, at least, like most of my characters usually end up being either, except for one who was asexual, they end up being a lesbian or bisexual in some way. And like every time, I think I had like 2 straight characters out of the thousands I've made.
And that's absolutely amazing, and like I love that you're doing that, because I've noticed that like in other D&D games I've played in, again, I'm not throwing daggers in any other DM that I've ever run for, but a lot of the characters in Power, the NPCs you encounter, are male. So I've made an effort in Tales of Asperran and in the world necessarily that a lot of characters that the party interacts with, Rose, for example, she's kind of like this badass monster hunting shepherd to the party, and I've made sure it's a woman. And in my home games, a lot of the Empower characters that interact with the party and are helpful, powerful friends are all women, because that's not something you see very often, and I think you should have more of it.
My favorite NPC is a badass female.
They're just so cool.
I remember for the start of the game I run on Mondays, I made a ruler for this town, and she was just really powerful. She wasn't a good person. I'll straight up say that. And she wasn't, and the town was filled with racism because it was purely for elves, humans, and half-elves. But she was very strong and had a party of, like, an army of were creatures at her dispense. But I let the party decide, do you want to continue to work for this obvious racist person, though it'll be safer, or do you want to help the people who are being oppressed, which were the halflings, half-elves, and gnomes? And the party was very much for helping the smaller races that were being oppressed for years. And they weren't at a level where they could help yet because they had to take on a were army, but they were discussing, like, how can we build a revolution to help them get out of this. And I was very happy that they went that route, because I gave them 2 options, like the safe route, the one where you could get paid and you will be safe and you will not get attacked, isn't necessarily the good route.
Yep.
So this is your choice, and they went with the good route, which made me very happy.
Nice. I'm gonna one up you and say that instead of a ruler for a town, I went ahead and made a yardstick. Thank you. I appreciate the laugh.
You have the perfect person to inject those kinds of jokes, because I love them and everyone hates them, and I love them.
Hooray!
Hooray!
I purposely don't laugh, even though I smirk, because I don't want to encourage it.
Oh, come on. Stroke the ego at least a little bit.
Yeah, I make those jokes all the time.
Good.
My players hate
Good.
it.
We're gonna invite you into our actual play game so I can have another person to bounce those jokes off to.
Hey!
My husband will laugh at it, but that's about it. Ashley and I will just be like, why?
Dialing a divorce lawyer as we speak.
I literally tell my husband that every time he makes one of those kind of jokes. I'm like, nope, I want a divorce.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
It's like, I love you, but that was one dad joke too much.
Fiance thinks about that whenever I put on jean shorts or think about it. I don't wear them anymore, but whenever I think about it.
It's like, I know you're thinking about putting on jean shorts. Don't you dare.
Don't you dare. Don't you put on those
I
jokes.
like what my legs look like, okay?
Oh, that's great.
Anyway, back to the topic at hand.
That kind of answers a lot of the question, or some of the questions that we had, like, where did you draw inspiration from and stuff like that. But it sounds like you draw inspiration a lot from real world and also from other shows, with your Garfield reference.
I think to build on that a little bit more, what I looked at for inspiration on how to do it was I looked at other shows, saw what they were doing, and pulled out things that I liked and were very, inclusive and positive. And when it comes to actual world building, My inspirations are very traditional in that it's, from the books that I've read. A lot of my elements, and like especially Asperran, how I do gods and divinity and just the way magic is used in the world comes a lot from Brendan Sanderson. It comes from, like book series like the Stormlight Archives and Mistborn and like the Dresden Files and things like that, just because there were things that I loved about them, and they inspired me to take what they had, change it, meld it, and what I consider improve upon it, and then put it into this world, like into this kind of world setting that I've been building. When I started from the beginning, it was very scientific.
So you just mentioned a bunch of series that I love.
I was going to say
yes.
you sparked something there.
Yes.
So Dresden Files is one of my all-time favorite series, and I use that for my inspiration for specifically for writing, usually not necessarily for games, because I don't usually play modern games, unfortunately. But honestly, like, I think our 5th edition game has the one that we will be playing soon, the actual play. We have our session 0 coming up on the 15th, and I'm super stoked for it. A lot of the elements that the DM Ryan has talked about sound very much like the Mistborn elements. And I was so excited when he showed us that and he was sharing. And I don't know if that was what his inspiration was, but there is mist outside and it's not safe outside of the city. Mm-hmm. And we are the people who are in charge of going and protecting against monsters that are inside the mist, that part was a little out of it. But I love those types of stories where it's not known yet and magic is real, but magic is different from the stereotypical world. With Dresden, he constantly is like making up his own spells and like trying to figure out what he's supposed to do, and he messes up all the time, and I love that because it's realistic and it's hilarious.
Yeah, that's why I'm super excited for this. To shamelessly self-promote, we launched our second podcast yesterday, on the 7th, and I have a party of all wizards, and that's, I have stressed to them
different.
Yeah, it's different. But I have stressed to them, I absolutely love wizards that want to invent their own spells. So please come to me and let me know what you want to do. And this is where earlier I said we are a loosely D&D game, because for the most part, if I find a rule is going to prevent narrative or do anything that gets in our way, I'm usually just going to ignore it. Just because our goal is to tell a fun story, not to just play a game. So like I'm telling them like, oh, please make spells, invent them. I love it.
That's one thing I liked about Monster of the Week actually was, and I mentioned this in our last podcast episode, they have a magic system where you don't really have a specific spell. Mm-hmm. It's not, you can cast Fireball, you can cast Mage Hand, you can cast Cure Wounds. You just have magic, and you decide what you're trying to do, and then the dice decide if you succeed or not.
Yep, I gotta say that is definitely an inspiration from that. I'm currently writing up a system specifically for Asperran, which is deeply rooted in like the world lore, but it pulls elements from Sanderson, it pulls elements from that. But I like the idea that everyone uses magic, but they don't understand where it comes from. They have their beliefs, which full-on religions were founded on those beliefs. But there's an idea that I've kind of pulled in Asperran was that people have always had magic, and people came first. So when they looked at this particular moon and were like, wow, our magic is stronger when this moon is here. That moon must be a god of magic. And then they sprung a religion, and then their belief coalesced together into an actual being that does have control over magic. But there's this kind of underveiling theme in my world, which we haven't explored yet in the show, but I've delved into in my home games, that magic kind of comes from a place that they don't necessarily understand. And to spoil a little, that place is literally your soul, which you may know is pulled a little from Dresden Files, from a very particular book. Mm-hmm. But when you in Asperran, when you use magic, you're connecting your soul with something else or someone else. So like if you're healing someone, in that brief moment, your souls are touching and they're making power happen. Or if you're trying to explode a thing, you're pushing your soul into a wall or a brick or a rock and blowing it up. Just most of the mages in the world don't know that yet.
I liked the magic system in Mistborn because I liked that each metal, like an outside source, was the cause, technically. And that's
it's like the catalyst.
Right. And certain people only could control one thing. And it was very rare that somebody could control everything. I liked that, and that also added a lot to their political and their economical setting in the story, because some of those metals were severely controlled to avoid certain people from getting access to them. And I liked that they didn't know what was actually happening. Like the main character, I liked that she was just like, she knew she had this gift and she didn't know why it was there or why she could do it sometimes but not all the times, and then she slowly learned, and you're like, oh, that's so cool.
And to take from that a little for like an actual play setting, just so I can kind of keep us in this little play space, but we were able to do with the first podcast, Tales of the main feed. We have a guy who doesn't remember where he came from, a young woman who lived in a small town her whole life and suddenly fled from home to go on an adventure, a tabaxi man who lived on an island his whole life, and then another kid who lived in a cult in the woods his whole life. So none of them have any kind of real inkling about what the world is really like. So the audience kind of gets to experience the narrative through four naive people who are learning about the world at the same pace the audience is.
Oh, I love that.
That's pretty cool.
That's like a thing that I have found works really well. If you have one character, because I've noticed in a lot of other shows, there was one particular show that I'm not going to name it, but I tried watching it because I really loved the DM that was running it, but I could not get into it. And the reason I couldn't was because every character, it was like every player was debriefed on the world. They all had an extensive knowledge of the world and what was going on already. So they would talk in a way that they knew about the world, which for me, the audience member, unless they are very good and very well written, and because it's improv, that just doesn't happen. But you'd have to ambiently pull out that information. So like in having everyone experienced, they have created a barrier for me to consume, to engage with the plays they're making.
I never really thought about that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I always have one character. I love having one character who's naive and doesn't know anything.
I can get behind that for sure. I like that a lot.
So we kind of answered how in depth you get in your city. You said that you give it like a brief overview and then let your players kind of control it beyond that. So when you create your cities and worlds, you create just like the landmarks. So you have a general idea of what's there, and then you create as you go beyond that.
Yeah. So usually, one thing I try to do is try to make the cities and towns feel different. So what I'll do is I'll pick out where it is, look at the location, and be like, oh, okay, so these things are obviously important to it. It's like this city's on the sea. The sea is an important thing to them. They have their back to a jungle full of monsters and dinosaurs. That's also important to them. And then I'll write a blurb or two about the city. Sometimes it might just be like me writing down like I'm describing an image of the city, or sometimes I might write a sentence about the person or group of people that are in charge of it. And then when the players get there, I'll usually build out things a little more right before we get there. And some of that is based off of I'll let players come up with rumors they've heard about the city if they've never been there. And then I'll weave those in so that some of it's true, some of it's not. But like you said, usually a city is a very blank template until right before the party arrives.
Nice.
And then I build out things that I know they're going to want to engage with.
So Natural One podcast had a question about homebrewing. When you're homebrewing your areas and you add your settlements and cities, do you consider the effect of local economy? And what research do you do before any types of homebrew?
Not super researched. I would say when it comes to building at least cities, that is probably one of my weaker aspects. But keeping that in mind, I do, when I said I look at a city and what's important to them, I do account for resources. And then I'll do a little tiny bit of research on like how a city might, be using those resources. And then I kind of use that to flavor a little bit of the structure, like I guess political structure sometimes. Again, it depends on city to city because I want them all to feel distinct.
Right.
To start with a city from the show we just released, it's the largest, kind of most in-depth city we have. I started with, okay, I want this city to be centered around this competition that adventurers climb into a hole in the earth and then race to the end to get gold. And then my next question was, okay, how do they fund that? Which then led me to, okay, there's probably a guild that funds it. Okay, now the Venture Association exists. Okay, who would want this guild to succeed? And then I have factions and power. And then I slowly build out the city by asking questions like that. So every one of my settings have started off on one thing that I thought was interesting. And then I kind of spider web out from that by just constantly asking questions of what I wrote. Usually it's like how or why kind of questions. And then I'll do research to answer those how and why.
That's really cool. Like I usually would, especially because as I've mentioned, I've never actually sat down and built a world from scratch or anything like that. But that's one of the biggest problems that I have with doing something like that is just starting with nothing, like a completely blank slate. Like once I have like something to go off of, I can kind of build something from there. But just getting my brain wrapped around, okay, this is the map. What like what is all of this blank space, what goes here, what goes here, so on and so forth. Like I have such an issue just like starting from scratch.
One thing I have for that specifically is once you have it, break it down into smaller sections. So focus on like do east versus west. Is something more prominent on the east coast or the east side of the country or the world than the west coast, like very much like our regular world. And then narrow it down further from there. Maybe on the West Coast, it's more likely to have arranged marriages and more of a monarchy, or maybe the East side is more of a democracy. Like you can focus it just purely on that. And then once you have those small ideas, you can flesh it out further. In worst case scenario, find like a generator somewhere until you see something that you like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
There's one particular generator I use to start off the bare bones of a city map. I can send it to all of you, but basically you just set up parameters, click a button, and it just keeps generating maps until you find one that you like. And then you
that's super cool.
I'll use that as it's like a very simple, it's like basic shapes, like basic polygons. I think the buildings don't get any bigger than like a pentagon in terms of like the complexity, but what I found is it's very, very helpful to just make random maps that feel good, and then you can kind of sculpt it to the place you're looking at.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I remember seeing a video, I believe it was on Facebook, I feel like, where it was like how to start a map basically, and somebody just grabbed a bunch of die and just like rolled them across the map, and it was like D6s are this, D20s are this, and it was like I think D20s were cities or D6s are like smaller towns and stuff like that, and they just kind of built a map that way, which I thought was really cool.
So if you're looking at building like a larger world, because you said you had no experience with it, at least my world started off of a very tiny isolated valley. In our world, it's called Ashmore. Some people might notice that I use that handle in a lot of circles, but what it essentially is a large settlement someone made a home in that was the result of a meteor landing. So there's just a big indent in the earth. There's a natural obstacle on either side, and I had a vague idea of what terrain I wanted on the other side of those obstacles. And then I just built out that one little place, ran a campaign in it. And then when I was comfortable, I scaled out and scaled out and scaled out until I built Asperran for what it is.
That's awesome.
I mean, to be fair, if you start in a small place and the players don't know beyond that, you don't need to have that information at the beginning.
Yep.
You need to have where they are and then maybe where they're from if they're not from there. And then anything beyond that is as you're visiting. If they're like, oh, you can go north or south, then you start to figure out what is north and what is south.
Mm-hmm. It helped too a lot that when I started that campaign, I was like, it's going to take place in this little valley. And If you want to leave, you can, but I don't recommend it. And then like players were like, oh, I don't want to be from this place. I want to be here investigating a crime from my kingdom, which is in a desert. And I was like, okay, well now there's a desert. And they were like, and the crime wants to be related. I want it to be related to a coup because my country and another country are at war. And I'm like, okay, now there's a war in the desert, which is still an existing thing in the world today. My players have never reached that region, so they haven't really felt the impact of it. But like, it's a kind of thing where like, even if you do start it in a small localized place, if your player's like, I don't want to be from here, that's a perfect springboard for like, ooh, okay, more places.
There you go. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It also helps you. I'm going to use one of my favorite words that I've ever learned in my life here. It adds a good amount of verisimilitude into your game, which is, I mean, it's just a way to attach real life things into a fantasy universe.
Let's look up that word and pretend I knew it. The art of a DM now. Okay.
It's a lot of syllables.
Yeah, that
I
makes
apologize.
The appearance of being true or real. The more
There you
you
go.
know.
Ironically, that word was used recently on Twitter, so I had to look it up like 2 days ago.
Well, damn. Here I thought I was introducing both of you to a new word, but you had to go and ruin that for me, Nikki. I appreciate it.
That's what I do. L from Birdhouse Mysteries asks, what's your favorite homebrew thing, whether character, location, lore, etc., that you've come up with?
Oh, this is a gem. Okay. This is my most exciting thing because it was something that my player wanted to do, which a normal DM would be like, that's insane. Absolutely not. But I leaned into it, and it has literally made a god in this world.
Oh, boy.
He wanted to be he wanted to be a rogue. Except he wanted to be a rogue who didn't remember who he was. So every time he leveled up, he remembered more about who he was.
Okay, cool.
He also wanted to be a skeleton. And I was like, okay, that won't work in a city because you'll probably be killed on sight. So
yeah,
I gave him a hat of disguise, which that slowly blended into both of us absolutely loving the idea that he wasn't a skeleton. He was a spirit trapped in the hat. And the hat always had one face that he could keep on all the time, which was his identity, his normal identity. And then he had stuffed his skeleton with pillows and things to make room. And we played a whole campaign. The party didn't know for the longest time, but it created a homebrew race called an Imaginum, which is it's essentially an intelligent item that can possess people or corpses or automatons. Corpses and automatons, much easier to possess. If you're possessing a person, there's a chance that, one, you lose the Battle of Wills and you get kicked out. Right. Two, you win the Battle of Wills and this other spirit is slowly bleeding into yours and you're forgetting who you are.
Oh, shit.
So, like, every time you fail, every time you fail harshly in a contest with whoever this hat is possessing, he would come out with a new personality quirk that was from the person he was trying to take.
Oh, that's so cool. I love that.
And they went the whole campaign. And what made it weird was, like, he would just reach into his jacket and pull stuff out. And they're like, do you have a bag of holding in there? No, he was just stuffing stuff in the ribcage of the skeleton that he was possessing. Like, at one point, he was like, yeah, I'm going to jump off the roof. And I was like, dude, bludgeoning damage. You were going to die. And he goes, no, I'm not. I was like, why? And he goes, you know, a grapple hook you killed me by? I was like, yeah. He goes, I tied it to my spine. Okay. So he has a permanent, he could just reach into his shirt and pull out a grapple hook and throw it.
Oh my God, that's incredible.
The whole campaign was filled with antics of him slowly, like, dancing on the line of the party knowing, finding out. And they found out by the best way possible, and I applaud him for this. For anyone who follows our show, it's the player who runs Tedward, so you can kind of see where this came from. But they encountered an NPC. She was an enemy. And she was holding a fragment of a god of luck. So they couldn't hurt her. She was very hard to hit. Everything against her had disadvantage. So just by the aura of her luck, they couldn't hurt her. But they managed to pin her down and tie her up. And she wouldn't talk. So the skeleton, the hat player goes, guys, I have an idea, but you cannot panic, and you need to ensure my hat touches her head. And they're like, what do you... And before they could finish the sentence, he just took the hat off and collapsed into a pile of bones and junk on the floor.
Oh my god, that's amazing.
And they were like, what? And somebody picked up the hat and they could hear his voice in their head. He goes, put me on the body. And they're like, what? They put it on the body. And this is where the god thing comes from. The woman had a fragment of a god of luck. Because at that point, there was no physical form for the god of luck. It was just a power that existed. And I was rolling a contest of wills to see if he could possess her. He became the god of luck in that moment. Mostly because the dice allowed it. We rolled a contested charisma check. Their modifiers were wildly different. They rolled the same exact value 3 times in a row.
Jeez.
That's insane.
On the contest. So I was like, okay. I was like, after you successfully possess her, there is a moat that's like calling to you. Do you grab it? He goes, yes. And I was like, okay, now there is a physical body for the god of luck, and he's a spooky skeleton man. With a hat.
And God, I love that so much.
Yeah,
he's like, guys, I have an idea, but everybody needs to be really cool about a lot of stuff really fast.
Yeah, and it was wonderful. And like after that cat came out of the bag, I realized how overpowered it was, because at one point they had encountered a wizard who was guarding an archive that they needed to get through to warn someone of an attack on the city. And rather than fighting the wizard, he just tackled him to the ground and put his hat on him. And then he slurped into the body of a wizard. And he was like, all right, let's go. And he just left the skeleton behind. I'm like, oh no.
What have I done?
What have I done? But granted, it's one of those moments where like any DM in their right mind would have been, that's absurd. But like we just kept feeding off of each other and it made the experience so much better.
I hate
That's
it, but
amazing.
I love it at the same time.
I was going to say, like, I would have been one of the DMs that would have been like, no, like, come on, really?
Yeah. I was like, okay, I love this because it's insane and I want to make it work. And it was all for that single payoff moment, because I was like, I know at some point the party's going to find out and I want to be there when it happens.
This is why you do yes and.
Yes.
Yep,
and
100%.
Yeah, that's by far, that is my favorite homebrew thing that has happened, because it spawned, I have a homebrew race. It needs a little bit more balance to prevent you from, possessing archmages. But I've like have it all written up as like a race you can pick.
I mean, you could make it where you can't repossess a body you've previously had.
Yeah, I think I ended up writing that in. It's been months since I've looked at that, because that campaign happened at this point 4 years ago, maybe.
Gotcha.
So it's been a while, but I'm pretty sure it's balanced out now. And if you try to possess someone and fail, there are like, for every failure, it's almost like exhaustion. For every failure, your disadvantages get exponentially more. Like the first one, you gain a tick from that person. Like if that person liked to smoke cigarettes, you're constantly craving cigarettes. Or like if that person, had a habit of doing finger guns when they said something they thought was cool, he would just start doing it and not really understand why.
It's like, why can't I stop finger gunning? This is a serious conversation.
Yeah. And then like after a certain point, their spirit overwhelms yours and they just obliterate you. So if he failed these rolls too much, his character would just outright be vaporized. And he was like, I love it.
Damn, nice.
He also wanted to be vulnerable to bludgeoning damage, which is hilarious.
It's funny. So what is the most memorable moment your players have had that you can think of?
I think for this one, it will be I'll talk about it for the show, because I've had a lot of home game experience, but for the show in particular, spoilers, this has to do with a tiny sentient blueberry for any of you listeners out there who may not be caught up. But
a tiny sentient blueberry?
Oh, that's it. Okay, so I gave them a watering can made by one of our listeners that if you poured it on a plant, it would bring them to life. It would cast Awaken on them. Well, they had given this to the druid. They had put it in the game expecting their druid to take it. Instead, the big, dumb, crunk barbarian picked it up, and he poured it on some blueberries. And now they have a sentient blueberry named Twoberry who follows them around. He's like their little mascot. But
amazing.
They were in the dream realm, and they had slipped Twoberry into Tedward's pocket to keep him safe while they were in the dream realm, because they didn't want him wandering around and somebody stepping on him. Well, in the dream realm, Tedward was knocked unconscious as a spirit. So it rocketed back towards his body. It landed in the wrong body.
Oh God.
So the little blueberry, they're like, "Where's Dewberry?" He climbs out of the pocket and stands up and he goes, "Hello, where am I? My name is Tedward." And they're like, "What?" And then there was like a side quest of them getting Tedward out of the blueberry's body and swapping them back, which means the blueberry soul was also in Tedward's body.
That's
Oh
amazing.
Jesus.
But yeah, he played like 4 episodes like as a talking blueberry.
That's fantastic.
Oh my God.
So there are a couple more questions.
Okay, I have time.
Does the fact that you're creating a world, I know you said that you started Asperran prior to it being like for an actual play, I mean. Now that it's for an actual play, does that adjust your way of thinking when you're creating more things in the world?
I would say absolutely yes. When I started, I didn't know much. I was kind of an isolated person as well. So my builds were very traditional fantasy, like Tolkien-esque. And as I grew older and learned more and evolved more, eventually being comfortable enough to make this a podcast, I've kind of come up with the approach of, one, make sure whatever I'm talking about doesn't punch down on others. I don't want it to be a place like that.
Right.
And one particular mindset that I've really I heard from and deeply enjoyed. They've made this game, this universe called Swordsfall, which is like an RPG setting. It's like an Afropunk science fiction fantasy kind of thing, and it's awesome. But there was one particular thing they said on one of their tweets that really caught my attention and shifted how I do my world building now, which was they like to look at the world they're building not as a reflection of ours. So like there's a very kind of important reason why I don't really try to include racism in my games unless my players want that experience, because like I said before, people look at a TTRPG world that they're engaging with, and if they see a reflection of something that they experience on the daily, they just don't want to engage with it. So like the thing from this particular game writer was that they want to make a place that always asks the question, what kind of place could our world be if things were better? So I kind of approach Asperran now with the mindset that, like, if I'm going to introduce an element, the idea of making a city where the rich are in control and there's a poor class who is exploited, it can be engaging, but I'm like, I don't want to do just that. How can I take that concept and make it better so that it doesn't punch down and it doesn't kind of serve as this like gamified reflection of stuff that a lot of people in real life encounter every single day of their lives. So that has kind of like really influenced how I approach world building now. Because before I would have never thought of that because I was playing with my 5 friends at home.
That's definitely
Sorry,
fair.
I know that was a lot.
No, that's fair. And the last question is, do you watch or listen to any actual play podcasts or games that you draw inspiration from, whether big or small? I know we talked Critical Role, we talked Adventure Zone.
Yeah. The big ones, ironically enough, I don't really listen to them anymore. I have kind of moved on from larger shows and have been following a lot of smaller indie shows. To make this easier, I'm just going to pull up my subscription feed because I listen to a lot of them.
Go for it.
Not nearly as many as I would like, because I listen when I drive, and we're in quarantine. I'm not driving anywhere.
That's fair. Very fair.
Some that I have pulled that I have been really listening to lately. One, this is a larger production, Campaign Skyjack's campaign podcast. They have this kind of anti-colonial story that I've been following for a long time, and it's amazing. They do the best job I've ever seen at being inclusive and also taking things from our world without disrespecting anyone, like appropriating, which is so cool. For a while, I was listening to Dungeons and Daddies, which is much more comedy based. It's again a bigger production, and then a lot of the indie ones. So some of them aren't D&D, and I find that has helped me create more because I think of it from a non D&D perspective.
Mhm.
Rolling Misadventures, they play a game called Fiasco. Another one is going to be Dimension Door. They're playing Paizo's, like, I think it's called Reign of Winter is the name of the arc that they're running. And I've also started listening to a show called Dice Populi, which is like this show. They have a rotating cast of DMs, and
Mhm.
they're like on an island chain. So every DM is every island is a new DM with a new story and a new place. So they're like island hopping. And Thornvale is a Monster of the Week show that I have been listening to on and off. I love them, but I just so much time. And I think that's it in terms for inspiration and stuff. They have really helped me listening to them has really helped me reconsider what I can do to make our show better.
Very nice.
I will definitely be looking into some of those.
I can.
And by the way, Nikki, that is how you pronounce Dice Populi, not Populi.
Oh, is it Populi? I was gambling on that being right.
No, that's absolutely. At least, I mean, if you're looking at, just like the basic pronunciation, that's how I would pronounce it. I just give Nikki shit all the time because she can't pronounce things.
I can't. I see things written. I never actually say them, so then I pronounce things wrong. And then when I learn it pisses off Greg, I do it on purpose.
Yep. That sounds
like
about
Pugilist.
right. Yes, for instance.
One other that I want to add, I didn't mention them because they aren't on my Google feed because they're on Spotify. Top of the Round. They have been kind of with our show since the beginning, especially Nikki from their cast. She kind of helped me figure out how to even get into the whole actual play podcast scene successfully. So I owe the world to their show. They also showed me how to use spooky music in the creepiest ways possible.
Do you use an app for the music, like Sirenscape or anything?
So when we're running the game, I do not, mostly because of the method in which I am recording. So like a lot of people use Craig to pull in all the feeds, but I do a thing where Discord is piping my microphone into the left channel of an audio track and everyone else is into the right, just because I found it streamlines editing a little bit faster. And I use a lot of royalty-free music for the show. Our intro is something that I made with GarageBand. I'd like to do the same for our next show, but my computer decided to die. So,
damn computer.
But yeah, tools like Sirenscape and things like that are great. There's also, if you're ever running a home game and you want to pull in music from like places like YouTube, like a YouTube playlist, there's a bot called Rhythm you can pull in. That all you have to do is give it a link to the YouTube channel or playlist and tell it to play, and it'll just play that music or ambient sounds or whatever you want. Oh, all of our ambient sounds, I use a producer called Swordcoat Soundscapes. They make really amazing, kind of engaging, like 20-minute ambient soundtracks.
Very nice.
Places.
So, where can people find you and your podcasts?
So you can find our podcast on just about any of the free podcatchers. I can't like Spotify, Podchaser, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, and a lot of the other free ones. I can't guarantee that if you have a paid podcatcher, it'll grab it because I know you have to apply for them individually. But you can also find us on our website at www.toapodcast.com. And we're on Twitter at Tales of Asperran.
And how do you spell that?
Yep. Tales of Asperran.
Aspirin. Got it.
Aspirin.
So thank you, Mike, for joining us. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me.
You guys, please go check him out and his game. I've been talking to Mike for a couple of weeks now on Twitter, and it's been fantastic. And you can also find us on Twitter at Beholder to No One and on Facebook at Beholder to No One. And you can listen to our podcasts wherever podcasts are.
Yes, indeed.
That's free.
Woo! Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for being here, man. It was great.
We'll talk to you guys later. Bye.
Bye-bye.